Hey guys, I guess I'm a little overdue on another video since summer's about over and half the country's on fire. But I suppose this is probably the lantern that a lot of people are looking at. These are a lot more common. This is going to be the dual mantle version of probably one of the most popular lanterns that Coleman made. So I'm going to do a little tear down on this one and see if we can get it running, but I'll at least identify some areas for you to look at if you're trying to get one of these running. This one's in pretty poor shape, but I think it's fixable. So when you're dealing with some of these old lanterns, you want to kind of look at a lot of the safety aspects of it, especially when it comes to rust, cracks, things like that. You want to make sure it's not going to leak. I'll go over that a little bit more when we get down here, because as you can see, there is some rust right there. But as I can tell so far, it's not leaking. So the first thing you want to do is remove the vent nut, set it aside. The vent on these is going to come right off, just a hole. Obviously, be careful with the globe. This is a reproduction, Pyrex, made in the USA. So it is a good one. Always keep some shop towels handy. Just kind of wipe things off a little bit. There's some spider webs in this one. Just kind of wipe things off as you go. Maybe even keep a little compressed air handy if you got it. So these aren't as easy to take apart when it comes to the cage and everything like that, because you've got all these screws and nuts down here. If you want to remove this and you want to clean down here and you want to check everything out because of the rust issues you might be having, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to remove, well, you can remove the generator first. So that's probably going to need to be cleaned anyway. So you're going to grab a 3/8, if I remember correctly. Not a 3/8. 7/16. Take a 7/16, loosen that nut. Just like on the 200A, you're going to have a little arm in there that goes up and down. So you just swivel this little guy out of there, pull it down and out of the tubes. That's kind of what it looks like on the inside. This is what you're going to want to clean, all this carbon. You're going to want to clean all that off of this stem. And then you should have a nice tip right there on the top. And then the tube itself, clean that off with some steel wool. And inside of these, sometimes it'll be easier to get out, sometimes they won't come out at all. But there's like some parchment paper, some type of wick, if you will, inside of there. That can determine whether or not your generator is going to run well. Unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do to repair that easily. Anything can be repaired, but really, if that's bad, then it's just worth getting a new generator at that point. So now we have that removed, and if you're lucky, it'll be nice and clean brass underneath, so the corrosion, won't have gotten past too much. On the back side of the generator tube assembly, you're going to have like a little screw on the bottom. It's just like a set screw. This one happens to be a Phillips. I've seen flatheads. So you're just going to want to remove that. Careful to not strip it, because it could be kind of corroded in place. So you'll remove that screw. Just a basic looking machine screw. The next thing you're going to want to do is remove this guy, because you can't move the cage around without removing this. So I believe this one was 3/8. believe it's 3/8. This one's kind of gunked up, so it came off anyway. Well, maybe it is 7/16. And a basic, standard wrench that will give you what you need to get all of these nuts and bolts off. This nut just happens to be so gunked up that the wrench isn't fitting very well. But there's two screws here. So the one to remove, ironically enough, is not the one that I removed. It's the inner. The outer one is kind of what seals your graphite seal that's in there. But this inner nut, there we go, is the one that you're going to want to remove. Like I said, these are so gunked up, the wrench barely fits. So as you remove it, you're going to see that little arm in there going up and down. And I'll show you why. This little guy right here, when you move this, that rotates, and that's what causes the little armature in there to go up and down, which cleans your generator tube. So now that is out of the way, you can remove your entire assembly here. I have this ground down bent wrench made specifically for this nut. Otherwise you can get to it as a 9/16. This is a special tool that I bought, which helps. There's like a little washer underneath the whole assembly that loosens up. And so you can see this whole assembly's getting a little bit looser. So once that's loose, the next thing to do and this one's got some rust right here, so I'm gonna go ahead and try to loosen some of this up with some of this Aerocoil, and see if I can kind of loosen all this up to get this removed. So I let that Aerocoil kind of soak in all of these areas right here. And then the next thing I did, I took this monkey wrench, put it on this base, and then you hold the fount, tightly against your body or something like that, and you turn counterclockwise. What that's going to do is it's going to loosen this whole top assembly. And what you'll see in a moment here is, so we've loosened this kind of 9/16 clamp nut that tightens the cage, and then we remove this whole assembly. So your air tube comes down into here. So removing that set screw only allows you to remove your air tube from this brass fitting, which is not absolutely necessary. Just depends on how you want to clean your pieces, because this is where your air comes up and it combines with those gases which come down into these tubes where your mantles will be. So mine is full of cobwebs, so I'm going to clean it out, but I may not remove it because the rust down here indicates that it might be more damage and more trouble than it's worth to remove this from this, and the net gain is going to be very little. Once that part is removed, your cage will come off like so, and you can give it a little wash, wipe it down with some steel wool, clean it up, and then you'll have something that looks like this. You'll have your collar, your vent stem, and your wheel are still going to be there holding this on. So the next thing you're going to want to do then is take your 9/16 and remove the nut holding the vent wheel on. Then, once that nut is removed, then you just unscrew the wheel. So mine is probably going to need a new graphite seal. This one was in there pretty good. It shouldn't necessarily be that difficult. And as you can see, this one is really bad. So this is an example of a graphite seal that is bad. See how it is all cracked, gunked up? Probably would have leaked had I tried to push fuel through this. I would have had fuel coming out right here, dripping onto the fountain. It probably explains why this is all rusted right here. Because if this seal is bad, this is not going to hold the fuel in. No matter how tight you make it, it's just going to crush it even more. That graphite seal sits between these two brass fittings. When you tighten it down, those clamp together, and it pushes that graphite out, and it just kind of seals that tube, but it allows you to still turn this to allow fuel to pass. So we're going to have to replace that. Once that's removed, you can just simply remove that little can collar there. And it's all dirty. I'm going to wipe it down. At this point, if you haven't already, make sure that there's no fuel in here. It's really just going to make it a messier project for you. If you can hear rust inside, take the cap off and try to clean it out the best you can. If you need some tips on rebuilding this pump, you can check my other video. I'm not going to get into that too much on this one. So I'm going to start cleaning this up, and we'll return when it's wiped down a little bit. All right, so I basically just wiped it down, sprayed it out with some compressed air, took a look at this, made sure that it pressurizes. Watch my other video for details on that. Made sure there was no bad gas in it, made sure there was no gas in it. Check this cap to make sure that seal was still good. There's like a little rubber gasket in there. This is just a single piece. Technically, it's not correct, period correct for this lantern, but it'll do just fine. These were kind of like the replacement caps. So you just kind of make sure that that gets a good seal. If you're pressurizing it and you hear kind of like a squealing noise, check the cap. It's a culprit of that kind of leaking air. And then I just kind of wiped it down. I hit a little bit of steel wool on this piece and just kind of cleaned it up, and I cleaned out this tube a little bit from where that graphite would be. So speaking of which, we're going to go ahead and rebuild that valve where that graphite was bad. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a little flathead screwdriver, and we're going to remove this flathead screw here. that's holding on the cap, or the knob, I should say. Having the proper flathead usually helps with this part. So you simply just remove the small screw. This little plate will come out. You can wipe that down. Then this knob will come off. You'll see a little splines. There's splines that line up on this as well. Remove the 9/16 nut. Then you're going to have that little problem area. So a lot of times there'll be gunk right here, and this won't want to slide off. So what you'll do is you'll take a little bit of steel wool and wipe it down. Sometimes that graphite's just going to break down and fall off. Try to keep the steel wool off your tools, because what will happen is it'll magnetize them, and you'll have steel wool all over your tools. So the graphite just kind of fell apart because I was a little rough on it, but it's getting replaced either way. So slide that off. Remember, there's two of them. The big one is on the outside, smaller one, and then there's like a little retaining locking piece right here. So slide that off. I'm going to go ahead and slide the other one off, and then I'm going to have this tube. And all I'm going to do is just wipe it down with some steel wool. Just get it nice and clean and fresh. Wipe it down with a rag. Now we have a nice clean part ready for new. These little guys, you can go ahead and wipe these down with some steel wool too. All this stuff was installed clean when it was new, so if you're going to fix it and go through the trouble, might as well clean them off. Alright. Slide that bad boy on, and you'll see it won't go past that locking ring. And there's kind of like there's a flat portion and there's a recessed portion. The recessed portion is going to go in towards where this would screw into the lantern, and you'll see it'll stop it from going any further down that. So this one's just got some residual graphite on it. I'm just gonna give it a little steel wool, and I use quadruple zero steel wools, the extra fine stuff. You know, that's all you're really gonna need, because mostly you're just polishing brass. So this one's clean and ready, but before we install that, you're going to take your new graphite and slide it on to the tube. Should have just kind of a nice snug little fit. Be gentle. I mean, it's just compressed graphite, so don't be too rough or you'll break it. Then it should look like that. Nice, fresh brass pieces and graphite. If you need some graphite, go to these guys. They're going to have it in stock. Old Coleman parts. I order a lot of stuff from them. They're quick shipping and get you the right parts. So the next thing, I'm going to go ahead and clean this guy off. It's the 9/16 nut. It's pretty gunked up from leaking fuel from that bad graphite seal. You can clean these brass pieces, you know, as well as you'd like. With brass, it's pretty much the more time you take, usually the nicer it'll look. You know, you can You can use some brass cleaner, some Brasso. Sometimes that Brasso, in fact most of the time the Brasso is going to give your brass kind of like pinkish hue. If you go online, there's different methods as far as cleaning brass. There's like the vinegar and that kind of thing, but usually just some warm water and wipe it down, and a little bit of fine steel wool will usually do the trick. And so it's a little better than it was. I'm not going for perfect here. This lantern's just kind of been sitting around, just going to see if we can get it running. So now you've got that on there. The knob's a little dirty, so might as well clean it off real quick. Okay, you just put that on there. Wherever you want to index it is fine. It's not going to make a difference. Same thing with this. You can just pop that right back on there. You can adjust that when you're all done just by simply loosening this screw a tiny bit and then you know, turning it to wherever the closed position actually is when you're finalizing things. So don't get too hung up on where that is and that kind of thing. So just make sure it's pressed all the way down. It's fighting me a little bit here. You know, these, you know, double mantle lanterns are going to be kind of the more common ones you'll find, and maybe it was your grandpa's or your dad's or something, and these are the ones that they sold the most of. So that's nice and rebuilt, so that's great. You just kind of commence with wiping things down, and I'm not going to take a ton of time doing that. And again, you can take as much time as you want. Depends on how clean you want your parts to be. This one is a 220F. You know, this is that kind of, you know, tin can style collar, we would call this, the collar portion. You know, a little bit of steel wool, get some of that kind of surface rust off of there, make it look a little nicer when we're all done. Not a huge deal. Sometimes they get a little bent out of shape and you can just kind of eyeball it. Slip that right back over there. And you'll take this guy. First thing you're going to do, gently press that new graphite seal in and start screwing the entire assembly in, and it should slide in nice and good. So you'll get to a point where it'll get tight with just the knob. That's fine. Don't over torque it. That's not really what you're worried about as far as sealing it. Next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to put this 9/16 nut onto those threads. So if you're putting a new graphite seal on, it's going to push against you a little bit. So you kind of got to push and turn to get that going. And as you tighten this down, it's going to push that graphite seal in, and it's going to squeeze it between those brass pieces, and that's what's going to create your seal and prevent this from leaking. So I've got the threads started, and it's going to start to give you a little bit of resistance. You can go ahead and take your wrench and start screwing that down. And you just kind of go until the resistance really starts to push you back. You don't want to over tighten this part because that's how you ruin that seal, and we'll end up in the same predicament. So kind of go, and then it'll give you some obvious resistance. We're getting pretty tight there, and then we'll kind of slow down. One way that you can check it is you unscrew this. If it is extremely difficult to turn this knob, back off about a quarter turn. Check it again. It's feeling pretty good. So I'm going to leave it right there. The final check on this screw, or on this nut, will be when you actually have fuel and you're trying to light the lantern. You're going to want to watch this if you're putting in a new graphite seal, because what will happen is when everything heats up, this will become very easy to turn. But that's because that graphite seal is now expanding. So you could get some leakage through here, and you want to keep an eye because that could start a fire. So when you do your first fire up, you're just going to want to watch this area primarily, especially if you're replacing that seal. And then you either tighten or loosen this as necessary to make sure that you can, number one, open and close it, but number two, that it's not too loose to where you're actually getting fuel through this portion. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and clean some of these other parts and get them ready to reinstall. Alright, so everything's wiped down. Cleaned out these tubes. Made sure that there were screens here and these little, burner tube areas. Basically, burner tube caps. There should be a little screen in there that breaks up the flame, gives you a nice pattern. Critters like to come in here, well, bugs rather, like to make little nests and cobwebs and all kinds of things. So clean these tubes out real good. You can burn them out too, but if you just spray them out with some compressed air. I cleaned this up with some steel wool. Should be able to turn freely like that. Again, the generator, just kind of polished it up with some steel wool. Cleaned all that carbon off. Made sure that the tip cleaner was still there. And just kind of pop that in there. We don't know if it's going to be a good generator or not until we can give it a test, but it's clean, so that's the kind of first step there. And then the little eccentric block, is what they call them, is in pretty nice shape. So, the first things first, you can go ahead and put your cage back on the little can collar. There's two holes, so make sure that you're lining it up properly. It's not really going to matter too much at this point exactly how it lines up. Just make sure that you're screwing through the right holes, the most center hole. Put your air tube in, and then your other one, and turn the whole assembly. You should start to feel a thread. Yeah. So it's kind of an awkward design. It's kind of difficult, but there may be some other tricks to doing this part, but this is what I have found to be the easiest for me. So once you kind of start to get that resistance, you're going to want to take your monkey wrench, and you're going to want to turn it. Now you have to keep in mind that this guy right here is where that comes out. The proper position for this is between the cap and the knob. So it's going to want to be right here. So when you get that nice good resistance, you tighten it until you get it lined up perfectly between. Then you know, okay, that's where it's supposed to be. So this is still going to be a little loose, and the reason for that is you have to tighten that 9/16 washer on the bottom. And that doesn't need to be super tight. The only purpose of that is to keep the cage from being loose. So you want it to be tight, but it doesn't need to be overly tight. You don't want to bend anything. Okay. So just kind of check your cage, make sure it doesn't move. Look at your collar, make sure it's centered around that knob. Everything looks pretty good here. So go ahead and install the next piece. The next piece gets installed sort of in line with this eccentric block. So what you're going to want to do is put your eccentric block in and then put that part in. Hold your eccentric block up a little bit and start screwing this part in. You'll feel it grab your block, and it'll want to take the block and move it up and down. That's how you know you've installed that part correctly. So you'll take your 3/8, assuming that you've cleaned these nuts off. Your 3/8 should fit. Mine, however, apparently are not 3/8. I don't know why. Apparently the 3/8 wrench that I have is just not very good, because this is another 3/8 wrench that works fine. So you do want this part to be snug, because that brass fitting can't allow fuel to come through, and that's bad. You don't want fuel coming out anywhere except for the burner tubes. You don't want to burn down your tent or your camper or the campground. So it's going to screw all the way in, nice and snug. Don't over torque it. Then I loosened this outer nut earlier, so I'm going to re-tighten that. And that's just, there's another little seal in there. So that's, again, is just one. You can kind of measure how snug it is. You want this to have just a little bit of resistance. So just a slight amount of resistance. Not too much, not too little. Too much, you won't be able to turn the tip cleaner. Too little, and you will have fuel running out. So that's about good right there. So now we have that. Put the eccentric block in the up position, which means this is going to be in the up position. You'll see a small hole on the top of the eccentric block. Swivel your generator up into the burner tube with the hook end out. Hook the bottom of the generator through that eccentric block. Make sure it is set in there, like so. Slide the tube down. Slide the nut over, and then just tighten it down. So take your 7/16 wrench. Tighten that generator block snug, nice and snug. Don't over torque it, don't strip anything. If that's not snug, you'll definitely get fuel coming out, and that's a bad day. So I'm going to loosen this just a hair right here. Make it a little easier to turn. Okay. So now we have, the bail is going to be horizontal to the face of the lantern. Your burner tubes will face off to the left. It's not going to be 100% on every design, but generally speaking, this is the proper alignment. Knob, tip cleaner, cap. And of course, you're always going to have that on the other side. This is kind of the proper facing of the lantern. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put some fuel. Before we do that, you're going to want to do an air leak test. So make sure your valve is closed, your cap is closed, and just start pumping air. You're going to do about 50 pumps, and what you're going to want to be listening for is air. Any air leaking. Air leaking is bad, because air leaking means you're going to have fuel leak. So if you stop and listen, you shouldn't hear anything. Then, when you open your valve, you should hear air passing through your tubes. if you turn your knob or your tip cleaner up and down, you should hear it stop when it's in the up position and go when it's in the down position. That means it will cut off your fuel properly. When it's in the up position, your lantern should not be burning. When it's in the down position, you'll have full airflow through the tubes. When you open the valve all the way, when it's lit, it's basically just going to give you that nice, good flow of fuel. I open mine all the way and then I turn it back about a quarter turn. That's just my preference. There's nothing that says that that is the way it is meant to be done. Just a preference. So I'm going to go ahead and close it. Should hear all the fuel or the air stop. Okay. Then when you open the cap, you should hear that air come rushing out. That means more than likely it's going to run just fine. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and add some fuel, and I'll show you how to light it without mantles just to test it. So now comes the fun part. You can go ahead and test out your work and see if you can get grandpa or dad's old lantern to light up. It's kind of fun to preserve these things, especially if they're family heirlooms or something cool you found at the antique store, and you know, now you want to make it work. They built these with, you know, a pretty foolproof style, and you know, if somewhat maintained, you'll always be able to get them to light up. So go ahead and put about 25 pumps in there, close it, and open your valve, quarter turn. You should hear a little bit moving through even with this closed. So you're going to hear, this is your first light up, you're going to hear a hiss, and it's just going to be air. If you don't hear any bubbling, it's just air. It's not going to light. So you're going to want to kind of work this around, watch for those fuel leakage areas that I told you about, and wait until you kind of hear that popping, sizzling noise like some fuel is actually coming through before you try to light it. So leave this in the down position, open the knob, and then close it a few times. What it's doing is it's soaking this wick with fuel. And when this gets completely soaked, it starts to get the vapors up into this tube. That's what you're burning, is the vapors. You're not burning the liquid fuel. When the liquid fuel is coming out of these tubes, that's bad. So what you can help it along, you can heat this tube. And what that does is it helps the vapors travel up, and it expands up into this tube. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and heat this tube up, maybe. You can actually see some of those vapors burning, even though this valve is closed. All it is burning is fumes from inside of this tube. So now we know that we have fuel passing through. Still a lot of air. It's not picking up as much fuel as we need. So I'll go ahead and close that again. And again, this generator may or may not work. We're not really sure yet. If the generator is in good shape, it will run like this without mantles. one of the tricks to it though is heat. If you don't get heat, you don't get proper burn. So this generator is not the greatest, but it is working. So you can see that you can get these to run without the mantles just for testing purposes. When you get the mantles on there, it captures that heat, and it actually heats that generator up more, and that will result in your lantern running better. The hotter that generator gets, it runs at an optimal temperature. So check your leak areas, run your finger underneath this, make sure there's no fuel. Make sure you don't have any fuel dripping anywhere else. And I do not. So we could probably throw some mantles on this and have a nice running lantern. So that's really all there is to it. If you want to see me make a video about something specific that maybe I didn't touch on enough today, drop a comment and let me know what that is, and I will try to get that video done and demonstrate how other things are cleaned or disassembled or assembled. And you can get these running again. Alright, thanks for watching.